Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining me for this week's edition of the SMIE Consulting Midweek Roundup. I'm your host, Marty Bennett. Today's Wednesday, November 23rd, the day before Thanksgiving in the United States. And today we're going to be answering three questions we've been hearing from international educators for the past 7 days. Obviously, last week was Open Doors Week, and that always means a flurry of activity surrounding data and other stats and facts about international students in the United States, U.S. students studying abroad. All of those fun data points come to bear during International Education Week. And we'll talk a little bit about that in our stories today, but we covered a lot of that last week in terms of first reactions to it. But we will ask and answer three questions that we think will help you on campus better understand what the future holds for international education in the U.S. Now, as we do each week, we take our news stories from that we cover in question format here on the Roundup from our newsletter that comes out on Mondays at 9 a.m. Eastern, and the name of the newsletter is called All the SMIE News Fit to Share, and I'm dropping the links to three different items and ways you can go about getting our newsletter. First is our SMIE Consulting website, going to the /subscribe tab, adding your information in, and getting the newsletter delivered in your inbox on Monday morning. The second link I'm dropping is the actual email version of that newsletter that you'd get. And we also, for those who prefer to get their international edification via LinkedIn, we have a LinkedIn version as well with over 800 subscribers now to that newsletter. So we encourage you to make sure you include these news stories in our newsletter in your weekly reading, whichever format you prefer, through email or LinkedIn. We are happy to accommodate you and subscribe you to our newsletter. So that newsletter, All the SMIE News Fit to Share, that stands for Social Media and International Education News, the name of the company. And we focus on those. We usually have about 8 or 9 social media stories, 15 to 25 international ed stories, oftentimes where the overlap is between those two areas. And then we come up with, from all of those news stories, we come up with the themes for our roundup here on Wednesdays. I want to give a special shout out to those watching live today here on either Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, or YouTube. Thanks for being a part of the conversation. Happy to take your questions as part of this news roundup here. But also want to thank those that watch on repeat on either of the any of the social media channels, or listen to our audio-only podcast version via your favorite podcast provider. So very grateful that you're making us a part of your weekly journey. Now let's get to our first question of the day, and it is, how are numbers looking for fall 23? I know it's early, and believe me, I know when I get these questions from administrators from the university, it often is one like, oh, really? You're asking me now? But no, seriously, obviously everybody wants to know, and everybody needs to keep their leadership informed as to what the trends are in terms of numbers, where the peaks and valleys are that might be coming our way in the coming year. And when the next class is, we're actively in the middle of recruiting it now. They're beginning their applications to our institutions. They're weighing up their decisions between competing institutions in terms of offers. And then in the spring, hopefully making the right decisions and choosing where to come to a place that's right for them. But what we always do, at least at the undergraduate level, there isn't kind of a running total that we get like UCAS in the UK gets of applicants in. That's truly universal, because in the UK there's one application form you fill out for up to 6 or 7 institutions or programs, I should say. In the U.S., we don't have that, as we know. We're very decentralized, and we look to common indicators of what common factors there might be in application trends this year. Certainly the news coming out of the pandemic we saw reflected in the Open Doors data, particularly in the fall snapshot survey. We saw the increase of 9% in new numbers this fall from the surveyed institutions. And those institutions represent over half of the enrolled international students in the United States. So those are likely the trends that we should see a year from now when Open Doors comes out for 2023. But what that is an overall number. That's not undergrad, and numbers for undergrad are really the only ones we get early doors enough to start making some predictions. Now, the one that we're referring to today is from Inside Higher Ed with a story about Common App numbers. Common App, for those not familiar, about 900 U.S. institutions are part of that allows students to use the same application, international students included, the same application information to apply to multiple institutions. So what we're looking at in terms of data points for this year, what Common App has done because of the pandemic, the 2021 and the 21-22 year, they've kind of taken those out of the formula and are looking just at pre-pandemic 2019-2020 applications, and then looking at current year's data. So from overall data for the United States, or I should say Common App applications in general, the first tranche of numbers, so that applications are up 41% as opposed from 2019-20 to now. 41% increase in the number of students who are applying through the Common App. They're now, I said over 900, there are 841 members for purposes of this study. I should say Common App has more than 841 members, but only those same 841 that were members pre-pandemic and pandemic now are included in the mix. So as I mentioned, there are about 900 overall for members of Common App. But again, this is just for undergraduate applicants. The good news is first-gen apps have increased by 43%. Underrepresented minorities are up by 32%. So really encouraging data there. We now look at the information we have on international applicants is kind of scant in this, but it's always been a good indicator, frankly, of where application trends are going at the undergraduate level. And the good news is international applications are more than triple that of the rate of increase is more than triple that of domestic applications. So 63% more international applications this year, 22-23, as opposed to 19-20. So that's encouraging. Leading countries, home countries by applicant volume were China, India, Nigeria, Ghana, and Canada. Now, China, a lot of those are students who are applying to some of the elite institutions in the United States, tend to be trying to get those selective institutions to take them, and they are all on almost all of them are on the Common App. So interesting on that list are Nigeria and Ghana. Certainly, Nigeria and Ghana not in the top 10 of international applicants. Ghana's not even in the top 25 source countries for international students, but at the undergraduate level, Nigeria and Ghana's I think number 11 or 12 on the top sending countries to the United States, but good to see two African countries represented in the top 5 countries, source countries for students that are applying to the U.S. via Common App. So that's a good early indicator. So that's that increase of, I should say again, that's 63% more than the applications we had in 2019. So that overall volume's up. There was a Common App that was down a couple of years with the pandemic, so that's why they're not including that. But at least pre-pandemic to now, international applications are up 63%. China has always, I think, in the last decade or so, led the way in terms of numbers. But India, and this is an important data point here too, they're the number 2 source country overall for international students in the United States. They will soon become the number 1 within the next year. I predict they're actually right now, as of this fall, looking at the See Us by the Numbers report, they were within 11,000 of where China is. I think it was 251,000 Chinese students in the U.S. from the See Us by the Numbers September report to 240,000 Indian students in the U.S. By the same report. So we'll see what happens. But Indian applicants have traditionally 80+% usually have been designated international or graduate interest, applying for master's or doctoral level programs. So to see India as the number 2 country for undergraduates, undergraduate first-year applicants, is also encouraging. And little known fact, India is actually the number 2 source for undergraduate students in the United States, not just the number 2 overall, but number 2 for undergraduate students after China. That lead is a little bit larger. It's probably about 50,000 or so between India and China, 80,000 to 30,000 currently from this current CVIS by the numbers data. So keep an eye on India. It's growing in interest for bachelor's degree studies as a percentage of their overall total. It's not as an increase because grad went through the roof this past year and probably will continue to grow as the greater majority of Indians coming to the U.S. will be for graduate. But in terms of volume, India is a huge source country for U.S. bachelor's degree programs. So it's worth keeping an eye on that. And if it's not already on your radar, I'm going to be doing a session at AIRC in Los Angeles next month on the Indian undergraduate market, along with Manisha Zaveri from Career Mosaic and Derek Alex from University of Houston. So encourage you to join in on that session if you're attending AIRC. And we'll have more on the India market. But certainly as far as the early numbers for fall 23, at the undergraduate level at least, applications are through the roof, 63% up from pre-pandemic levels. So I think that's a real good marker for where interest is going and where hopefully enrollments will follow this coming fall term. So that's enough for question 1. Question number 2 is an even more relevant one. Will Chinese students return to the United States? Anyone who's been in international ed for more than 5 years, 6 years has seen the Chinese numbers coming to the United States consistently decrease. This was even pre-Trump. Numbers were starting to interest was starting to wane in terms of new students, but certainly during the Trump era and during the pandemic, Chinese numbers have fallen off a cliff. So, what the question on everyone's mind is: will Chinese students return to the United States? And it's not a simple answer for most people because there's a lot of data points that you got to sort through. There's a lot of tea leaves that you got to read in terms of interest within China. There are numerous surveys that say, well, maybe China is slipping. Maybe China is on the way back. No, this is just a pause. So we'll take a look at all of those to see what we're talking about here. But I feel fairly comfortable saying that China is never going to go away. It will always be a major source of students for the United States. Just in terms of sheer volume, again, China as a population has always been valued education. A couple of the news stories, one of the news stories, the University World News story that I'm sharing in the chat, has a really good take on the history of education in China and how it's evolved, particularly at the higher education level. Yet there's still this thirst for overseas education amongst the Chinese population in terms of what they value. The Chinese diasporas around the world are enormous, and every major American city in the Americas has a Chinatown. Canada down to Chile and everywhere in between has Chinatowns. So there's a huge diaspora populations in the United States, across the Americas, around the world, most Western speaking, even into major parts of Africa. In conjunction with their Belt and Road Initiative, there are Chinese diasporas in those nations as well. So it's clear that when you have a quarter of the world's population living on 8% of the world's arable land, as one of the articles points out, there's always going to be a need for exploration and settlement and immigration. And that's part of the Chinese character in terms of spreading their message, spreading their influence, both privately and publicly. They make that an important part of their mantra as a people. And they've always been explorers. They were some of the earliest explorers in the world, finding other nations and even having some of their money wash up on the shores of Oak Island off the coast of Nova Scotia. For those who know, you know. But in terms of will Chinese students return to the U.S., I think what we've seen, and the article from University World News makes the point that their perspective is that the numbers that of drop-offs during the pandemic have been almost exclusively, in their eyes, pandemic related. I would say there's a mix of politics in there too. For some folks, there's the issues of safety that have scared off others. That's anti-Asian hate that has happened in the United States and other countries that has scared people off. So I think it's a little bit simplistic to say it's all pandemic related, but certainly what we see now, the interest is still there in China. No, most definitely. The challenge has been right now that there are still quite significant travel restrictions happening that restrict internal movement within China for students and families, and certainly not people coming in to try and recruit. That's almost an impossibility these days, even with the reduced quarantine times. Down to 5 days and then 3 days further of home quarantine. So you've got to pay for more than a week's worth of quarantine if you're a visitor to China. And so for us, that's not a reality. No one has budget for that. But in terms of Chinese students wanting to come, there are still restrictions in terms of travel that are preventing them from coming. That's why there aren't the huge numbers going to embassies and consulates, which have maybe 1 or 2 day wait times now for student visas, whereas opposed to India that has up to a year at one point, but that probably will be back down to a couple, 3 weeks by the summer. But in terms of China's appetite for the West, I think it's still there. Certainly the number of Chinese going to the UK has grown dramatically in recent years at the detriment of maybe they were turning off the US and looking at the UK more. But even then, within the UK market, they're seeing changes away from undergraduate like we have in the US to a more graduate program, which means they're working twice as hard because graduate programs are typically one-year programs, certainly the master's level in the UK. So they have to keep a churn and burn. They can't build up numbers really because whatever they recruit 1 year is gone the next. So for us in the U.S., obviously we have 4 years undergrad, 2 years plus for master's and doctoral programs. So it's a lengthier stay for those students. So we get more mileage out of them that do come. But what I will say is the numbers that the Open Doors data certainly reflects the change in the numbers, and there's a section in terms of places of origin, and China is now 31% of the total of international students in the United States, and that percentage has been shrinking as India grows closer. And keep in mind the Open Doors data is a year-old data from 21 to 22 academic year. The SIVIS by the numbers report shows that, as I mentioned earlier, there's only 11,000 gap between China and India in terms of total students in the U.S. right now. Whereas this one shows that there's about a 10% gap, which is about 50,000 students, according to the Open Doors numbers. So those two countries are quite significant. There's still almost in the U.S., as of the Open Doors numbers, 300,000, 290 plus Chinese students in the U.S., and those numbers will drop again for next year's Open Doors, just what we're seeing from SIVIS by the numbers. But what we do see is an attitude from the U.S. government that China internally is beginning to open up and potentially allow more students to travel. And when those floodgates open, we should then see a resumption. I will say anecdotally, I've certainly had conversations with folks in China, organizations that work there that have also reflected that it is beginning to open again, slowly, but it is. At UNLV, we had a visit from folks from the Chinese embassy in D.C. that visited our campus at the beginning of November, and had some very productive meetings with our team there. This came about because I had met with them at one of their staff at the Education USA Forum in D.C. in August. Then they reached out to me mid-October and said, hey, we'd like to come. We want to explore partnerships. And I think part of that is recognition on the part of the Chinese government and kind of not damage control, but reputational control, damage to reputation that had been done. There's obviously been a lot of bad press around Confucius Institutes and spying and all these wonderful things that tend to get politicized and really bog down opportunities for collaboration. But this willingness for them to come to visit our campus and really have the frank conversations about what we can do together and some of the hurdles that we've experienced and what can be done to maybe eliminate some of those hurdles. And it was a very open meeting, and we look forward to what that potential exists again. And there may be significant groups of students that come out of these conversations with other groups that we're working with in China as a result. So there's, I think, a new openness again, whereas the government in China, certainly President Xi is turning more inward and is turning more insular, insulating himself more from the world. The students and the appetites in universities are certainly more than willing to engage internationally again. So it's just a matter of how much leeway they are given by the government. So the sign from the embassy folks coming out to campus and visiting us and expressing a willingness to work with us and develop partnerships is certainly promising. I mentioned to our senior leadership, I can count on one hand the number of times in 29 years I've had an embassy contact us wanting to come to campus and visit. It's usually the other way around for a major sending country. So yes, I think Chinese students will return to the U.S. and perhaps sooner than we think. There's certainly a lot of potential out there. There isn't another India or China beyond those two, but they will continue to be the major sources for the United States, and we certainly can never ignore them as a major source country for our student bodies on campus, but also for future relationships with governments and institutions. You need to be open to that in both ways and making sure that there's opportunities for bilateral exchange. I know there will be opportunities for our students to go to China this summer on a program that will be very financially advantageous for our students to take advantage of, in terms of the ability for them to get exposed to what China is these days. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle that we certainly don't want to ignore. So yes, Chinese students will return. So let's get to our final question of the day. What is transnational education? Now, transnational education has been around for decades. It's really something that I think most in the U.S. Don't really understand well. And I'll share some data with you on these points. But transnational education, real experts on this are in the UK. UK and Australia are really miles ahead of us in all ways when it comes to delivering transnational education. The way the Brits define it, and I'm going to their definition, transnational education is education delivered in a country other than the country in which the awarding institution is based. For example, students based in the country Y studying for a degree from a university in country Z. The UK higher ed transnational education refers to UK degree programs delivered outside the UK. And the way that these programs are delivered can be any number of ways. Online distance learning, either with or without local support, through local delivery partnerships, for example, franchise delivery, joint and dual degree programs, twinning arrangements, validation and quality arrangements, or through a UK institution's physical presence in another country. Branch campuses, study centers through flying faculty. So that's how the Brits do it, how they define it. And if you are wondering, they have right now 162, if I can get the numbers out for you here. They have students, let me see, 162 higher education providers indicating students were studying via T&E was also the highest figure to date, up from 156 in the previous year. So 6 more UK institutions are now delivering their degree programs through transnational education. So to give you perspective, that is most all. I would say in the UK we've got we say maybe 150 in the UK, 150 or so. That's about all of the UK universities are offering some sort of transnational education, so nearly 100%. In Australia, 38 of 42 Australian universities have registered some form of transnational education. So any guesses? In the US, we have 77 77 transnational education branch campuses. Now, this is the one piece that I don't have full data on, is how many U.S. institutions have online or third-party degree type of delivery of programs out there. So that could be another mix. But even if it was triple that number, say 210, that would be less than 5% of the total U.S. higher education population, institutional population. If you go conservatively with 4,000 institutions, and there were 2,000 or 200, maybe 200 transnational education programs, universities doing transnational education, that would be 5%. We're not even scratching the surface of our potential when it comes to transnational education. We're amateurs at it. Very few are doing it well. There are, for example, Webster University. They've had campuses overseas for a couple, 3 decades in multiple countries. NYU has their Abu Dhabi and Shanghai programs. Duke has their Kunshan campus in China. There's Education City in Doha, Qatar. That's what we're seeing on the World Cup these days. There's U.S. institutions who have operations in Dubai, other places in the Gulf, Malaysia. But very, very few. We don't have a very big footprint internationally in terms of the U.S. when it comes to overseas programs, delivery of our programs overseas. So there have been U.S. study abroad centers that don't really count in this mix because they're not degree programs. They're study abroad programs for partners. The real quantity that I don't know enough about is I don't think there's been a real substantive report on this in terms of dual degree programs where full degrees are being offered through other institutions overseas, where our students from other countries can go to third countries or their own country if the U.S. institution has a partner university there for joint degree programs. And I don't have any data on the online programs. So there could be more, but obviously when you say a lot of the big publics in the United States have their Arizona Global, Purdue Global, UMUC Global. Those are all online program delivery that may or may not be available overseas. Whether they actively promote to overseas audiences, I doubt. But that there are certainly issues involved with delivery of your programs overseas, particularly if it's full degrees, and that students who get a fully recognized degree from your institution, fully taken online, that from their home country, there are tax implications, employment implications that need to be factored in, recognition of U.S. degrees online that need to be figured into whether you should go out actually be delivering those degrees in country. So the transnational education piece, again, the 3 levels, either online completely, through partnership agreements, joint degree programs where students can get your degree overseas, and then fully branch campus oriented programs or delivery of your programs through third parties. So those are the types of transnational education. The UK, as I mentioned, is kind of the granddaddy of them all when it comes to this. The link I've just posted in the chat gives the story of how UK higher ed, what their footprint is for transnational education. And I shared this fun fact with a friend the other day when we're talking about transnational education when I was actually on campus last week at UNLV, and shared that the UK offers more degrees issues more degrees outside the UK every year than they do to students in the UK. So that number works out to be, in terms of students that are currently enrolled, or at least in the most recent year's data for 2020-21, 510,835 students were studying in 228 countries and territories through UK transnational education programs. That's up 12.7% of the year before. So this is during the pandemic. So that might have had a little bit to do with the increase in that some of those students that couldn't travel to the UK might have been able to begin their programs through these UK universities that are set up, 162 of them outside the UK, around the world where students could enroll. So while the home campus might not have been able to enroll them for visa issuance or travel restrictions, they could stay at a UK university in their country, the equivalent. So a lot of those are in China. They have a major presence there, but they have transnational education locations around the world. In 228 countries and territories. Some of that would obviously cover a lot of the online delivery of degree programs too. So it is enormous. It is, if we looked at our overall international population in the United States, we have about 1 million right now. And for UK, they offer half of that million they have overseas, and they have another 600,000 that enroll in the UK. So combine those two together, they would have more than we do in the United States if you look at transnational and in UK international student enrollment. So quite significant. We are well behind in that respect, and only more work to do to get to where we could even be competitive with them on a regular basis. Australia has also been active in international branch campuses and looking into other markets for where they can go. But there's been a move to get more engaged with India because of during the pandemic, many Indian students were forced to take their Australian degrees fully on their mobile phones and pay basically as if they were in country for that privilege. So that has led to maybe some eyes being open to what the potential is or not in India for transnational education. But what Australia's view of this is where China has certainly was a major focus of transnational education during the pandemic and still is for I think 28% of 28 to 30% of Chinese students who enrolled in Australian universities are still back in China because they can't get visas or they can't get travel to come. So for them, we have a number of established programs in China that are doing well, continuing to do well. Some that are doing them in transnational locations through in Singapore, other parts of East Asia, and then we'll be in a better position to see what's next. But that's a lot of what's happening with transnational education in the United States and around the world. Again, a very small footprint for the United States, but the rest of the world is certainly miles ahead of us in the Western world, with certainly UK and Australia taking the lead. And a lot of potential to grow in that area for the U.S. So hopefully your campus is exploring some of those options, maybe starting small in one location and growing a footprint out there, identifying countries that might be good places where you can do online delivery of your programs, where you can work out the tax and legal and employment and recognition issues that are needed to make sure your degrees are worth something in the countries you want to deliver them in. And that's what we have for you this week on the Roundup. And I look forward to chatting with you again next week as we look to the end of November and moving into December on the 30th. We look forward to connecting with you next Wednesday at 1 p.m. Eastern. Until then, have a wonderful day.